Hey, hi everyone. My name is Gabby, and I am the district's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Program facilitator. And in today's session, we're going to dive a little deeper into what privilege, power, and bias are, and how they appear in the classroom and across society more broadly. Understanding power and privilege are very important when you're navigating not just work related to equity and diversity, but also when you're interacting with students and colleagues from various backgrounds, as a lot of it boils down to oppression and ways in which students not always have access to the same opportunities and resources. And because us as educators need to be building these tools to ensure equitable learning environments for all students, it's very important that we have this awareness so we can navigate tools to ensure this. So we do need to be analyzing our work and the education system through a very critical lens and identify how we may be reinforcing existing inequalities, even if unintentionally. And I think going back to these sociological concepts is the very first step of the journey. So take this VL almost as an intro to sociology course that you would have taken in school, and with more tips on what you can do to embed this awareness of biases and privilege into your practice. So I want to start by talking a little bit more about how do we function as a whole. So our society is built around things called systems of power, and these are ideas and rules and traditions that people have created over time. They are socially constructed, and they essentially decide who has power and who doesn't. So in this case, power could mean things like who gets to control schools and hospitals and our laws, or who gets to make the rules, whose culture and values are seen as normal or most important. And as I mentioned, these systems can give certain groups more power, even if they aren't the biggest or the majority. And they can also take away powers from others. So when we're encountering words like racism and sexism, homophobia, ableism, and a lot of those isms, these are all examples of different systems of power that we encounter in day-to-day life. And they essentially compose how our institutions, like our education and healthcare, work. So these systems, they are rooted in inequality. So we often have groups with more control or with more ability to shape policies and access to resources and influence cultural norms, whereas other groups are usually excluded and marginalized and denied of the same opportunities. So when I talk about systems of power, I did mention the word socially constructed. I just want to emphasize this a little bit more because it's important that we have an understanding of what socially constructed means. So there's quite a few things that people assume that are exclusively biological or natural, but that's not always the case. A lot of its things and its meaning and its importance and impact are shaped by people, cultures, and institutions. So some examples of things that are socially constructed can be money, for example, or borders between countries, concept of nationality, and so on. And one thing that's socially constructed that a lot of people don't actually know is the concept of race. I think it's a very common assumption that race is something biological and genetic, but scientists have been thinking this idea for quite a bit now because genetically, humans are 99% identical to each other. Our observable traits, so things like our skin color, or hair type, facial features, or height, body proportions, these are controlled by a very small variation in our genes. And most of these small variations are not really linked to deeper biological functions like intelligence, behavior, or capacity to learn. And, despite these differences, we're still 99.9% identical genetically. There's not enough of a biological variation, let's say, to justify categorizing people into different races because we're technically part of a single race, which is the human one. But even though there's not enough of a biological reason to divide us, we have still found ways to do that. And this classification and division has been used over time to create hierarchies of intelligence and morality or capability. And they have been used to justify power imbalances and things like colonialism and slavery and discrimination, despite all these things being unsupported by science. So it just shows that even though socially constructed ideas, they don't really have a biological basis, they still have a very real socioeconomic and political consequences. So it's very important that we have that awareness that some things that may have been presented to us as biological or natural, they're actually not. And we as a society have a power to influence these concepts. And system is something that is born out of ideas that are socially constructed and out of this dynamic of inequality that is created by systems of oppression. So now we can dive a little bit more into what does privilege mean. So privilege means certain social advantages, benefits, or degrees of prestige and respect that an individual has by virtue of belonging to certain social identity groups. So we have this picture here. This is called the Wheel of Privilege, and it shows different power and privilege dynamics between different groups across society. So the closer you are to the middle, the more privileged you are. So if you want to take a moment to pause and look at the different categories, we can see that overall, people that belong to categories like white, heterosexual, neurotypical, rich, and educated will give you a certain advantage. So these would be the people that, at least in Western societies, would hold more power. Does that mean that you're a bad person for holding this advantage or being part of these specific groups? Absolutely not. No one asked for this privilege the same way that no one has asked to be underprivileged. That's just how the world works because of the systems of power that have been here for many, many centuries before any of us were born. Getting rid of your privilege is also not something that you can do despite how bad we feel over, the oppression that other groups are facing. Unfortunately, it's just something that you carry with you as life goes on. And if you're privileged, that also does not mean that you can't struggle. It doesn't mean that you never had to work for anything in your life. It just means that you haven't had to struggle more because of certain aspects of your identity, like your gender or your race. If you're having a hard time grasping this, I have some numbers here to put things into perspective. So, here in Canada in 2021, only 11% of Indigenous peoples held a bachelor's degree or higher, compared to 35% of non Indigenous people. And a report by Statistics Canada in 2023 also reviewed that women and girls accounted for 2/3, so 68% of victims of family violence, and nearly 4 in 5 victims of intimate partner violence. So this kind of just shows us that it's not a coincidence that these things are happening. Our systems of power and how they perpetuate inequalities and differences in opportunity, they do play a role in this. So we can see here that simply by not being Indigenous, you're more likely to get an education. And by not being a woman, you're less likely to be a victim of intimate partner violence. There's a reason why these groups are overrepresented here. And this is what privilege is all about, in power and inequality. So simply by not being part of these groups, you're already at a better place or an advantage. Even if you didn't do anything, that's just the way that it happens. And one thing they're going to notice too is that most people, they hold privilege in some ways while also being oppressed in others. You can benefit from being white, for instance, while also struggling for being gay or low income. And there's a concept called intersectionality that explains exactly this. So the term was coined by a woman called Kimberly Crenshaw, and she defends that most people experience different layers of oppression at the same time. So you can struggle for being a woman, but you're going to struggle even more if you're a Black woman or a Black queer woman, which is why it's very important to look at issues through an intersectional lens, so we can see where power can collide and intersect when shaping people's experiences. And again, this mixture will shape how the world views you and how you view the world as well. So if you grow up very privileged and you were surrounded by people in a similar position to you, it may be harder for you to see the challenges that others with less privileges face, especially in a society where the voices that get lifted and heard the most are from privileged people. And this limited perspective can also lead to bias. You're probably tired of hearing this word, but let's unpack this together. So, a bias can be a tendency, inclination, or prejudice toward or against something or someone. So everyone holds biases, whether they're positive or negative ones. You're not immune to it, and being aware that they exist doesn't mean that they will immediately disappear overnight. I do a lot of work in this area, and from time to time, I still find myself being biased over things, and that's normal. And most of the time, we're not even aware that we hold these biases. They can 100% be unconscious. And they happen essentially because of the very quiet messages that are passed down to us as we interact with the world and with society and with the institutions around us. We develop biases very early in life. So, fun fact, scientists have shown that babies as early as 3 to 6 months old already have preferences towards a face that matches the gender or race of their primary caregiver. And just a few hours old, newborn infants, they already prefer listening to a language that they heard in the womb over an unfamiliar language. And of course, as they grow older and they turn into toddlers, they begin noticing more similarities and differences across different groups of people. So, whether they speak different languages or from different genders, if they have different races, and they start to more clearly separate people along these dimensions. This is work that they're doing on their own, but then on top of that, the adults that are around them that are going to come in and fill in some of these value gaps by subtly communicating about the different kinds of people that they think are smart based on ideas that were passed to them when they were also children and continue to be reinforced as they became adults. So it's not just the adults as well who are directly related to a certain child that is teaching them things like their primary caregiver. It's also the adults in the schools. It's the adults who are writing and filtering news stories and airing them out in the media. It's the adults drawing the kids' books that they're reading. And the adults are writing the policies that affect their rights. Or, the doctors and adults that treat them in hospitals. So it's everybody and it's everywhere, even if you don't notice it. And these messages that these kids are receiving are essentially teaching them who they should approach and who they should avoid. And with further learning, children figure out not only how to categorize other people, but they also learn more about who they are in the world based on all these messages. They learn the meaning of their own race, the meaning of their own gender identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and so on. And as a result, they come to feel belonging, preferring in groups, and perhaps expressing negative attitudes towards out groups. So we have a little bit of a us versus them dynamic going on. So I have a quote here that talks exactly about this. I really like the first sentence. Who am I? The answer largely depends on who the world around me says I am. And then the quote goes on to talk about how people come to internalize these messages through things like representation in leadership or in the media, or if they're missing it from the picture altogether. So the longer that people participate in biased institutions and structures without critically examining them, the more they become indoctrinating into believing that inequalities like racism and sexism are a normal part of life when those ideas have been strategically put into place and reinforced to continue favoring those who hold the most power and privilege. So just capping everything I said so far in case you're lost. So we have society that has different systems of power that grant privileges to certain groups and oppress others, meaning that they have less privilege. And holding privilege or lacking it changes your perspective of how things work and how you are going to observe the world, which leads to biases, which are these preferences against or in favor of someone or a group. Now that we know all of this, how do we really see these biases and all that play out in schools? So that can look like a lot of things because you're going to have a lot of biased adults trying to juggle all the other biases that are passed down to kids. And it's a very tricky dynamic to navigate. So sometimes, we can see bias in the way that a teacher is calling on certain students more frequently. Because, for example, we have research that shows that sometimes teachers at all levels, they have this tendency to primarily call on white male students because we're taught to think of white men as more intelligent than other groups. This can also look like lack of representation in the materials chosen for a lesson. So we don't have a lot of books representing people from different backgrounds. And then if they do represent people from backgrounds, it's usually reinforcing a very specific stereotype, which can be really harmful. These biases can also look like, I don't know, assuming that people from certain races or certain backgrounds are going to have interest in certain things. Like, oh, you're from X race, then you must like this, or you must be good at that, or you must be bad at this. Also, assuming poor handwriting is a sign of lower capacity, not attempting to communicate with the student because of a language barrier, or not attempting to pronounce their name because you think it's too hard. So these are all things, and just a few examples of the ways in which biases can affect students. And out of them, most of them can be classified as microaggressions. I think most of you have probably heard this term before. So a microaggression is a small, often unintentional action or comment that subtly expresses discrimination or reinforce stereotypes. They're a lot more about impact than intent. Sometimes we may say these comments or may do these things again without realizing. And even though we didn't realize something, that doesn't mean that they're not going to have a lasting impact on students. Or sometimes we may say something and we may think that, it's a compliment and we're being very well intended towards it, but it might not be as well received as we intended. So, for example, not attempting to communicate with a student because of a language barrier. Yes, that can be a microaggression because it can signal exclusion and lack of effort to include non-native English speakers, and that contributes to marginalization. Or assuming poor handwriting can also be an example of a microaggression, especially for students with learning disability, motor challenges, or different educational backgrounds. It sends a very dismissive and ableist message, even if unintentionally. And microaggressions can have a very lasting impact on the body. So repeated microaggressions, they can cause a lot of anxiety, they can cause low self-worth and a long-term emotional stress, and sometimes the effects stick around well into childhood. And one thing about these microaggressions as well is that they can impact learning temporarily. So when we're stressed and triggered, our amygdala, which is the part of the body that deals with the fight or flight response, gets activated. And once it gets activated, it will release cortisol, which is the stress hormone. And that cortisol stays in our body for up to 3 hours and impairs learning completely for about 20 minutes. So when a student is constantly experiencing microaggressions at school, we're essentially telling them that they're not in a safe environment and their learning is likely to be suffering a lot of interruptions because of this exposure to stress and cortisol. And all of that together can affect their learning experience and can also lead to more serious health conditions down the line. We just want you to know this because if you're a person in a position of influence or power in a school, whether you're a teacher or admin or even just someone that others look up to, it is your responsibility to help create a space where people feel respected and valued, because we all deserve classrooms and workplaces where we can show up fully as ourselves without fearing being minimized or misunderstood. So if we know that we have biased views that we are unintentionally sometimes passing down to others and that's affecting their well-being, it is our collective responsibility to work on them. And for extra clarity, being part of a marginalized or racialized group doesn't make you immune to committing microaggressions. So we can internalize the same harmful systems that we fight against. And sometimes that shows up in how we treat others who hold different or the same identities than our own. We all carry biases, conscious or not. And again, being part of an oppressed group doesn't exempt us from learning, unlearning, and doing better. So this is something that we all need to work on together. But okay, now that we know all of this, how do I change? How do I finally start unpacking these biases? So I think that the best part at deconstructing your bias is by educating yourself. So this PL is a good starting point, but it will likely take more than watching, just this 20-25 minute video to truly get better at identifying them and unpacking these things. Because these were ideas that you have been learning and are ingrained in your brain. And it's a process that took probably a few years. So it takes a lot more than a video, unfortunately, to get rid of them. So we are more effective at challenging our biases and these perspectives when we're challenging the perspectives and stories that are given to us, while we're also taking some time to look inwards and understanding why we behave the way that we do and why we think the way that we do. So taking advantage of things like the wheel of power and privilege, that was brought up earlier in the conversation, or researching how different aspects of your identity impact your worldview will take you a long way. And you don't have to wait until you have conflict happen in the classroom to start unpacking your own culture and the biases that come with it. In fact, I find that the earlier you do it, the better. So then when conflict arises, you're more ready to face it. So we do have an EDI SharePoint where we have many resources that can help you in this journey. We do have a list of questions that you can use to begin reflecting on your own biases and culture. So you can use them as prompts for journal entries if you want. And then we also have more research and more articles and more toolkits that have been put out there by researchers and specialists on the topic. So I would encourage you to take a look at those and start doing that work, especially right now, earlier in the semester. And then after understanding your own culture and biases better, you can begin thinking about how these things have shaped your values related to your students and your expectations of them. So think about what learning behaviors you think every student needs to display, or how loudly or quietly they should speak, how much individual versus group work they should take up on, how long should they take to complete a task, etc. And how did you come to believe or expect these things about students? Just really get into those messages that were passed down to you about different groups and what success looks like, what intelligence looks like, and really expand on this. Because again, it's really important for us to be getting into this work, because sometimes we're constantly interpreting other people's behaviors through our own cultural lens and through our own biases. So by not checking these biases, we're risking misinterpreting people's intentions and actions. So reflecting on ourselves allows us to broaden our interpretations and explanations of these actions of our students and their behaviors, and as they also hold their own values, that were shaped by their own backgrounds, just like we do. So next time that you encounter some cultural conflict, I invite you to take these reflections and awareness and use them to not immediately make assumptions about your students. So if you see behavior that goes against your cultural values and expectations, I would encourage you to take a step back and try to describe them in your head first without judgment, almost like stage directions for a play. And then make a list of your own assumptions and reactions, and then try alternative explanations. And then, as an additional step, if you want, you can also talk to colleagues, parents, and community partners about your reflections and be open to the new perspectives and ideas that they may share with you in the process. And of course, be aware of situational appropriateness. So, in the classroom, we can't really ignore disruptive behavior that it's harmful under, that it's just your cultural label. So we have to have a little bit of common sense, but that also doesn't mean that we shouldn't be more open to understanding um, why we may be holding some assumptions over students, and be opening to broadening our own interpretations of their behavior. And sometimes that can be a bit uncomfortable because we don't like admitting that we are biased in some ways and that we have privileged, and we don't like to be confronted in general by perspectives and ideas that are new and question what we were always taught to believe in. So I always like having some emotional regulation strategies in place to tackle these big emotions. So remember that when we get stressed and when we feel threatened, we have the fight or flight response that gets triggered in students. So the same happens to us when we're facing a situation that we think it's difficult, or if we're talking about an uncomfortable topic. So I find that emotional regulation helps you preempt this trigger and avoid responding negatively. So I think identifying what triggers you and what emotions come up when that happens is a good first step to prepare. So there's a lot of different things that can trigger us, and sometimes we're gonna walk into a conversation knowing that's likely to happen. So for example, I find that I get a little triggered when I feel like people are underestimating my ability to do things. This is a big thing for me, And I know the typical emotion that surfaces when this happens to me is anger. And anger may not be the best way to lead with, especially in a school environment. So I like using something called SODA for this, which stands for Stop, Observe, Detach, and Awaken. So when you're in a challenging situation, before reacting the way they usually would, the first step would allow you to stop and pause before allowing that initial reaction to take over. And then in the second step, observe. Just take a moment to further check yourself. Still don't react, but maybe do things like taking a deep breath or drinking a glass of water or doing little things like this, because it takes about 10 seconds for the stress hormone to move through the body to the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that controls our ability to reason and reconsider. So there's still room for us to interrupt an amygdala trigger and listen to our wiser and higher selves. And then after this, and you're doing these things to redirect your attention, detach stage comes in, which is where you can try to redirect your thoughts to something else. So if you can't do that, awesome. If not, then you can continue to do things like go on a walk or drink some water, play with a piece of jewelry, or just shake your hands and legs to stop the emotion from taking over. And then finally, you can shift your attention to the other person involved in the situation and really think about what they're feeling and how the situation may be impacting them as well. So sometimes this can help you get out of this reactive mode and put you in a better position to have a positive interaction when you're confronted with something like a microaggression or a bias or a stereotype. I'm not saying that you should suppress your emotions or that you're wrong for feeling angry or uncomfortable by something, but sometimes these instinctual reactions or initial emotions may not exactly be the best way to take us where we want to go. I know the kinds of interactions I want to have when I have to talk to others in the role that I have. And sometimes I know that the anger that I feel when I get triggered will not serve me or help me in any way. So even though I'm technically allowed to feel it and display it, I choose to take these steps to outthink the emotion a bit, because I really don't think that that's a real expression of myself, and that's not how I want to go on about it. And of course, when we are thinking about biases and deconstructing ourselves, encouraging and opening our brains and our hearts to new perspectives, we have to be okay with the idea that we're constantly learning new things as we go. And we're never going to get to the place where we're like, oh yeah, I know everything I need to know about injustice, so I'm set for life. There's always a new perspective to consider. And although this can sound a bit overwhelming, it's also in a way kind of relieving, because I think it takes off the pressure of having to be perfect at all times and know everything by the book, because this is something that simply does not exist with this type of work. I think what matters more is your commitment to learning and doing better every time. So we ask you to remain very curious and open-minded, because this will benefit both your students and you. Of course, diversifying your social circles is also a big one. So pay attention to the type of media you're consuming, or maybe actively seek stories and perspectives from people who have different lived experiences from you, can also help you gain some perspective. So whether you're exploring books or documentaries, podcasts, or seeking to attend events or interacting with people from different cultures or their whole different cultural values, all of those can help you understand, you know, different communication styles and different cultures. And it gives you more perspective on how you've been raised and what was passed to you, what was passed to other people, and that both things can coexist. It doesn't mean that yours is better and that theirs is worse. It just means that these are different cultures, these are different perspectives, and that is okay. Here, there's also a tool that I always like to share. If you want to start questioning these biases and you're in the process of trying to unpack more things about yourself and understanding where your own culture comes from, sometimes taking an implicit bias test can help. So this was one that was developed by Harvard. So if you have a phone on you, you can scroll this QR code here and take it after the PL is done. Or if you can't scan the QR code, you can just look up online Harvard Implicit Bias Test, and it should take you there. And this is what we have today. So please reach out if you're confused. As I mentioned before, we have the EDI SharePoint with a lot of very interesting resources that are going to allow you to launch yourself into this journey. So if you go to the main SharePoint site that you see for Anglophone School District West, if you scroll down a little bit, you're going to see EDI SharePoint in one of these icons that are on the screen. So please feel free to browse through them. We also have a feedback form at the very end of our SharePoint site. And in that feedback form, you can tell me a little bit more about different types of resources you want to see, if you think something's missing, or if you have something to suggest in case you know a really good book or a really good video that you think other teachers would benefit from. So please don't forget to check that out and then let me know what you wanted to see. And again, we're always an email away. Don't think that you have to go through these things by yourself. Would love to help you. So my email is on the screen as well, and so is Tegan's. That's also involved in his work. So yeah, happy BL Day, and have a good school year.